Breathe in, and let the centuries unfold. Before time was measured by sand or sun, before the names of kings were carved into stone, before the first temple reached toward the sky, there were hands, rough, trembling, sacred hands, and they held a blade. No one remembers who first drew that blade across flesh. No one remembers the moment it became a ritual, when pain became meaning and blood became a bridge between the mortal and the divine. Yet somehow, across continents and millennia, from the deserts of Egypt to the highlands of Africa, from the hills of Canaan to the islands of Polynesia, the same gesture emerged, deliberate, intimate, irreversible, the act of circumcision. Tonight, as the hours drift into one another, we descend into that shadowed place, not to judge but to understand. We will not look away from the ancient hands that shaped belief, nor from the quiet horror that still hums beneath it. For in the oldest stories of humankind, the body itself was an altar, and every mark upon it was a message written to eternity. Imagine the dawn of civilization. The Nile murmurs under the light of Ra, the air thick with silt and incense. At the edge of the river, a group of men gather, their bodies painted with ochre, their faces solemn. The ritual is older than their language, perhaps older than their gods. They believe the foreskin is a sheath not just of flesh but of spirit, a veil between the human and the sacred. To remove it is to open the soul. The blade gleams, cold and unyielding, fashioned from obsidian or sharpened reed. It catches the first rays of sunrise as chants ripple through the morning mist. There is no scream, or perhaps there is, carried away by the wind, a single cry swallowed by eternity. What remains is silence, and the slow rhythmic breath of those who believe that in pain, there is purity. The first cut, the first covenant, but between who, and what? Historians whisper theories like confessions. Some say it was hygiene, born from the dust and heat of the ancient world. Others insist it was power, the control of the priesthood over the body, the claim of the gods upon their followers. Still others, in darker tones, suggest it was sacrifice, not of life but of wholeness, an offering of what was once complete to the mysteries that ruled the earth. Yet every theory, no matter how logical, begins to unravel when you look closely at the map. Egypt, Mesopotamia, Israel, Ethiopia, the Philippines, the Pacific Islands, far-flung peoples, divided by oceans and millennia, all practicing the same strange rite. No messenger carried it from one to another. No empire spread it by conquest. It emerged again and again, as though something deep within the human mind whispered the same command: mark yourself, and be known. It is in this mystery that we begin our descent. Close your eyes. The stars above the Sahara blur into constellations of forgotten gods. The dunes shift, revealing the bones of temples half buried in time. The air carries the echo of flutes, the rattle of sistrums, the murmur of prayers to gods of fertility and rebirth. Among the hieroglyphs carved into stone, we find depictions, small, discreet, but deliberate, of men standing before priests, a knife raised in ceremony. The inscriptions speak of purity, initiation, becoming whole through separation. How curious, to become whole by being divided. The ancient Egyptians believed the body was a vessel of divine order, and that the foreskin, like chaos, was a thing to be conquered. To cut it away was to align oneself with Ma'at, the principle of balance, truth, and cosmic harmony. A body marked by circumcision was a body disciplined by the gods. A body claimed. In this, the ritual mirrored their world. Every stone in their temples, every line in their hieroglyphs, every cycle of the Nile, all served a grand order, an unbroken rhythm. Even the body had to obey. But what of those who refused? What of the unmarked? Perhaps they were seen as outsiders, the untouched, the chaotic. In a civilization obsessed with continuity, they might have embodied the threat of disorder. To remain whole was, in a sense, to remain impure. And so the blade descended again and again, through generations, not as punishment, but as belonging. The act became a seal, of faith, of identity, of divine covenant. When the Hebrews emerged from the cradle of Egypt, they carried the ritual with them, not as a memory, but as a command. The book of Genesis would later crystallize it into a covenant between Abraham and his God, a sign carved into flesh, eternal and visible, a promise that could never be broken because it could never be undone. It is here, perhaps, that circumcision transformed from a ritual into a destiny. And as centuries passed, its meaning multiplied. Among the Hebrews, it was obedience. Among the Egyptians, purification. Among tribal Africans, initiation into manhood. Among island cultures, a passage between worlds. But beneath all of these, perhaps, was a more primal truth, that to mark the body is to declare that it belongs not to the self, but to something larger. The skin remembers. The cut endures. And somewhere in the silence that follows, the body becomes language. Now imagine again, you are standing in a circle of torches, deep within an African plain. The night is warm and filled with sound, drums pulsing like heartbeats, chants rising and falling in waves. A boy kneels before his elders, trembling not from fear but from the knowledge that this night will divide his life into before and after. The ritual is not private but communal. The cut is not shame but pride. Blood spills onto the earth, and the earth, it is said, listens. To bleed is to speak to the ancestors. To scar is to remember. Across the ocean, on distant islands ringed with choral and song, the Polynesians practiced their own forms of genital marking, circumcision, superincision, and other rites of transformation. There, it was not about covenant or law, but beauty and belonging. To be unmarked was to remain unfinished, a child in the eyes of the tribe. Only through pain could one be reborn as a man, a member of the living story. What unites them all, these scattered, ancient peoples, is not the knife, but the silence that follows it. That shared, wordless knowing that the body is not merely flesh, but symbol. And yet, there is an unease beneath the reverence. For what kind of world demands such proof? Perhaps the answer lies in fear, not of gods, but of life itself. The body, after all, is impermanent. It decays, it bleeds, it betrays. To mark it is to resist the inevitable, to claim mastery over mortality. A cut becomes a declaration, I am not prey to chance. I am shaped by will. In the hush of antiquity, where disease and death were constant companions, circumcision may have offered more than purification, it may have promised control, a fragile boundary between chaos and order, life and loss. And so the ritual survived, not as superstition, but as continuity. Each generation carried it forward, not always knowing why, only that it must be done. When the Romans encountered the Jews, they recoiled at the practice, calling it barbaric, primitive. Yet even as they mocked it, the ritual endured. When Christianity emerged, it spiritualized the idea, transforming the circumcision of the flesh into a circumcision of the heart. But the physical act did not disappear. It traveled through desert tribes, through Islamic law, through the colonized and the colonizers alike, until it became something paradoxically modern, a medical procedure stripped of mystery, yet still echoing with ancient fear. And here we are, thousands of years later, still circling the same question, why did they do it? Why do we still? Science will offer its answers, hygiene, prevention, practicality. Religion will speak of covenant and purity. Anthropology will say it is initiation, the binding of tribe and self. But history, that quiet, lingering voice, will whisper another truth, that perhaps the origin of circumcision lies not in logic, but in longing, the desire to transcend the body, to prove to the universe that we are more than flesh. Every ritual begins with fear and ends with meaning. And meaning, once carved, becomes destiny. As the centuries pass before your mind's eye, imagine the continuity, an unbroken thread of steel and skin, from stone knives to surgical blades, from chants under the stars to sterile hospital rooms. The setting changes, but the symbolism endures. Every cut is a remembrance of the first. Every ritual is a repetition of something older than language. And so, as the night deepens and the stars drift beyond the horizon, we return to where we began, a single moment, a single blade, a trembling hand. What if the first circumcision was not an act of devotion, but of curiosity? What if a wound became a revelation, that pain could sanctify, that blood could bind, that the body could speak in silence? And once that discovery was made, it could never be forgotten. The wound became the word. The scar became the scripture. And humanity, in its endless need for meaning, listened. So breathe again. You are standing now in the long corridor of time, its walls lined with the echoes of 1,000 rituals. You can almost hear them, the chants, the prayers, the silence after. You can almost feel the pulse of history beneath your skin, that strange inheritance carried through every generation. The blade gleams once more, and the question lingers in the air, patient and unanswerable. Did we carve the mark to remember the gods, or did we carve it because the gods once carved us? The wind sighs through the ruins of forgotten temples. The stars dim. The body, marked or unmarked, drifts into sleep. And history, ever watchful, keeps its secrets. Beneath the unending sun of ancient Egypt, the river Nile wound like a serpent of time, glittering beneath the breath of the gods. Every flood, every ebb, every grain of sand seemed to move to a rhythm older than memory. Here, amid the hum of cicadas and the whisper of reeds, the human story of the blade first took form. In this world, nothing existed without meaning. The stars were not distant, cold fires, they were the eyes of deities. The river was not merely water, it was life, death, and resurrection. And the body was the mirror of divine order. To understand the origins of circumcision, one must first understand this Egyptian obsession with balance, the delicate harmony of Ma'at, the cosmic equilibrium that demanded purity in every form. The flesh, to the ancient Egyptian, was not private but sacred, not owned by the self but by the divine order that sustained existence. The earliest depictions of circumcision appear carved upon temple walls, in the faint outlines of men standing before priests, their faces serene, their bodies steady. The scene unfolds in ritual quietude. The priest holds a knife of sharpened flint, the initiate bows his head, and attendants stand near with bowls of water and linen. To the modern eye, it is a clinical act. But in truth, it was a ceremony of rebirth. The Egyptians believed that the foreskin was not merely a piece of flesh but a remnant of primal chaos, a veil that separated the human from the celestial. By removing it, one symbolically cut away disorder itself. The body was made to mirror the heavens, smooth, precise, obedient. No one knows exactly when this practice began, but fragments of evidence suggest that by the time of the 6th dynasty, over 4,000 years ago, the ritual was already ancient. It was performed upon the priestly class, the nobles, and later the soldiers, spreading like sacred fire through the upper ranks of society. It was not forced upon children but bestowed as an honor upon those coming of age, a threshold crossed with dignity and silence. Inscriptions from Saqqara describe it as the purification of flesh before the gods, a necessary act before serving in the temple or stepping into the afterlife. To be uncircumcised was to be unready, unclean in spirit, incomplete in form. The Egyptians were obsessed with cleanliness, not merely of the body but of the soul. They bathed multiple times a day, shaved their heads to ward off lice, and anointed themselves with oils fragrant with myrrh and lotus. Every gesture was part of a dialogue with the divine, a language written in scent, movement, and ritual. Circumcision fit seamlessly into this cosmic grammar. Just as the pharaoh maintained order in the kingdom, the priest maintained order in his body. Each cut, each purification, mirrored the great act of creation itself, when the god Adam brought forth life from his own substance, shaping order from the void. To live within Ma'at was to shape oneself continually, to cut away chaos wherever it lingered, even in the flesh. Archaeologists have uncovered hints of these rites: flint knives buried with priests, ceremonial basins stained by time, depictions of men holding their genitals in ritual posture. The imagery is neither pornographic nor violent. It is reverent, detached. There is no sense of shame in these carvings, no secrecy. The act was not taboo but sacred performance. The priests stood as intermediaries between man and the gods, and their marked bodies were living scripture. When they lifted the blade, they reenacted a myth older than writing, the eternal separation between chaos and cosmos, impurity and truth. And so the ritual became cyclical, like the Nile's flood. Each year, as the river renewed the land, men renewed their covenant with the divine through purification. The process was accompanied by prayer, music, and incense, the air thick with the scent of kifi and blue lotus. The initiate would kneel, his head bowed, his eyes closed, breathing through the pain like a meditation. Around him, the temple walls shimmered with the light of oil lamps. Hieroglyphs seemed to move, alive with the whispers of gods who demanded order. Pain, in that moment, was not suffering but passage, a small death before rebirth. One can almost imagine the silence that followed. The priest's steady hands, the soft murmur of blessing, the crimson drop that fell onto white linen like the setting sun on desert sand. Pain and purification intertwined. The initiate, having shed part of himself, was made new. When he stood again, he was no longer simply man, he was a vessel. His body, once whole, was now holy. And from that moment on, every act of service, every word of prayer, every drop of sweat that fell in the name of the gods was touched by that sacred mark. The ancient Egyptians did not view this as mutilation. To them, it was completion. The body, they believed, was a reflection of the soul's state. To leave the foreskin intact was to leave imperfection unaddressed, a trace of primordial disorder that could corrupt both spirit and destiny. In the Book of the Dead, the unclean are described as those who bear the shadow of flesh uncut. For them, the afterlife was a place of precision, the field of reeds, where the soul lived eternally in balance. To enter it, one had to be whole in spirit and purified in form. The ritual cut was a passport to eternity. But there was more beneath the surface. The Egyptians were fascinated by the duality of creation, by the belief that all existence was born of separation. The sky was separated from the earth, the light from the darkness, the living from the dead. Circumcision, in this sense, was a miniature creation, an act of cosmic imitation. The flesh divided, the self remade. To cut was to echo the first divine gesture, when Adam divided himself to give birth to the world. In the rhythm of this act, they heard the heartbeat of the universe. Still, one cannot help but wonder about the fear beneath the faith. For every ritual carries within it the shadow of its necessity. Why, after all, must order be purchased through pain? Why must the body bleed for the soul to be seen? Perhaps the Egyptians feared the chaos that lay beneath all things, the ever-encroaching floodwaters, the diseases that came without warning, the sandstorms that devoured crops and lives alike. In such a world, control was salvation. To control one's body was to assert dominion over fate. The knife became a symbol of defiance, a statement that man would not surrender to the wildness of existence. Even the gods bled, according to myth. In the story of Ra, the sun god ages and weakens, and from his own sweat and tears the first humans are born. Blood and divinity intertwine. The very notion of life, in Egyptian cosmology, is born from the wounding of the eternal. Thus, To be cut was to participate in the divine cycle, to offer a fraction of one's flesh in imitation of creation itself. The cut man was, in a sense, a living echo of Ra's sacrifice, a walking testament that pain and order were inseparable. The priests of Heliopolis taught that in every act of purification there is a balance between loss and gain. To shed something of oneself is to make space for the divine. The foreskin, they said, was a remnant of the gods' first imperfection, a symbol of what was left undone at the dawn of creation. To remove it was to restore the body to its intended form, the form the gods had imagined before the world fell into duality. Thus, circumcision was not simply physical, it was metaphysical. It was the body returning to its origin, a gesture of correction, an attempt to align the human with the cosmic ideal. As centuries passed, the practice wove itself deeper into Egyptian identity. It became a marker of status, purity, and faith. Foreigners, especially the uncircumcised, were often depicted as barbarians, their difference not merely cultural but spiritual. In art, the Egyptians portrayed themselves as clean and perfect, while their enemies, the Libyans, the Syrians, the Nubians, were shown as wild, hairy, and unmarked. Circumcision became a boundary, a visible frontier between the civilized and the chaotic. To be cut was to belong to the land of order, to be in harmony with Ma'at. Even the pharaohs were not exempt. Herodotus, writing many centuries later, claimed that Egyptian priests and nobility practiced circumcision as part of their devotion to cleanliness and religion. While some of his accounts exaggerate, the kernel of truth remains. For the Egyptians, ritual and hygiene were inseparable. The sacred and the practical existed in the same breath. The cut may have prevented infection, but more importantly, it prevented spiritual decay. The body was a temple, to neglect its order was to invite disorder into the cosmos. It is here that one begins to sense the paradox of Egyptian belief. Their civilization was obsessed with permanence, the building of monuments, the preservation of bodies, the promise of eternity. Yet their rituals, like circumcision, were born from impermanence, from blood and decay, from the very mortality they sought to transcend. Every cut was an acknowledgement of fragility, every scar a reminder that eternity could only be earned through suffering. In the stillness of their temples, under ceilings painted with stars, they reenacted this paradox endlessly. To conquer death, they had to embrace pain. Imagine standing in that temple, the air thick with incense, the light flickering across gold and stone. You hear the hum of chanting, low and resonant, echoing through the hypostyle hall. The priest moves with slow precision, each step measured, each gesture deliberate. In his eyes, there is no cruelty, only devotion. The knife glints in the firelight, not as a weapon, but as a symbol. You realize that here, in this world of symmetry and silence, pain has been tamed. It has become art. It has become language. The initiate's breath catches, a tremor runs through his frame, and then, stillness. A drop of blood falls upon the stone floor, and the room exhales as though the cosmos itself has sighed in relief. This was Egypt's first blade, not of war, but of order. Through it, men entered the service of the gods. Through it, flesh became sacred geometry. Each incision was a prayer, each scar, a verse in the oldest hymn. The act transcended its own violence, becoming something serene, inevitable, almost beautiful in its precision. For the Egyptians, to live was to carve meaning into matter, into stone, into memory, into skin. And in the quiet that followed each ritual, they must have felt it, the weight of connection between their mortal fragility and the eternal rhythm of the divine. Somewhere along the banks of the Nile, in the golden age of pyramids and prayers, humanity discovered the strange truth that has haunted it ever since, that to make something sacred, one must first make it bleed. The lesson would not remain in Egypt alone. Like the river that nourished and divided their world, the ritual would flow outward, crossing deserts and seas, finding new meanings in new lands. But here, at its source, beneath the burning sky and the watchful eyes of gods carved in stone, it was still pure. Still holy. Still wrapped in silence. The first blade had been drawn. And from it, history began to bleed. The sun had long set over the Nile, and the desert wind whispered its cool breath across the temples of Abydos. The priests had finished their chants, their hands still trembling from the nearness of the sacred act. Somewhere in the darkness, a child's cry had faded into the night, and in its place lingered only the echo of the gods, an unspoken approval, or perhaps, a silence too deep to decipher. The torchlight trembled upon the carved faces of Osiris and Horus, gods who had seen every secret of the flesh and yet revealed none. Beneath their stone gazes, the sands glowed faintly gold, as if holding in their grains the memory of 1,000 rites, 1,000 offerings, 1,000 small sacrifices that had become the pulse of Egyptian time itself. Those who lived along the Nile knew this truth instinctively, that life was a cycle of cutting and healing, of dividing and renewing. The blade was not a weapon, but a mirror of divine will, an echo of creation itself. Just as Adam had torn himself apart to bring forth the gods, so too did man learn to mark his flesh, to draw a line between purity and chaos. The priests told of the serpent Apep, the great devourer who dwelled in the waters of the night, and of Ra's endless struggle to rise again each dawn. Circumcision, they said, was man's way of ensuring the victory of light within his own body, a ritual sunrise beneath the skin. The foreskin, once shed, was not merely a piece of flesh, it was a shadow cast off, a fragment of chaos cut away to let order shine through. As centuries passed, this act became the language through which Egypt spoke to its gods. Every dynasty carved it deeper into memory. In temple reliefs, the pharaohs were shown performing the rite themselves, a gesture both intimate and divine. Their bodies were more than human, they were symbols of Egypt's cosmic balance. To circumcise was to claim ownership over one's nature, to declare that the spirit had dominion over the body. In this way, every child born into Egypt carried within him the potential for transformation. The blade was not a curse, but a key, one that unlocked the divine architecture of man. In the cool sanctuaries of Memphis and Thebes, priests recited hymns that mingled the sacred with the bodily. The god Thoth, patron of wisdom and medicine, was invoked before every cut. He was said to have inscribed the ritual into the first medical papyri, his reed pen dipping into the ink of human understanding. In one fragment of a long-lost scroll, the ritual was described not as mutilation, but as restoration, a return to the original form of man as envisioned by the gods. The foreskin, they wrote, was an earthly veil, a fragment of mortality draped upon the eternal form. To remove it was to expose the hidden truth, to let the divine light touch what had been concealed. Yet the blade was never simply physical. The priests believed that within each man resided two currents, the upper river of reason and the lower river of desire. The Nile, flowing northward to the sea, was the mirror of these twin streams. Each year, when the river flooded, its waters brought both life and destruction, just as passion could bring creation or chaos. Circumcision was the containment of that flood, a dam against the excess of flesh. It was an act of control, a declaration that man was not ruled by his hungers. The ritual thus became a covenant of balance, binding each generation to the laws that governed heaven and earth alike. As the blade gleamed under the torchlight, one might wonder whether fear had played any role in the practice. Perhaps, in some distant memory, there had been terror, a fear of impurity, of the wrath of gods, of disease or decay. But over time, fear softened into reverence. The ritual ceased to be punishment and became instead a sacred inheritance, a whisper of the past etched into every newborn boy. The Egyptians believed that to be uncircumcised was to carry within oneself an unfinished story. The uncut flesh was seen as a book yet unopened, a text left unread by divine eyes. To remove it was to complete the sentence, to bring the self into alignment with the language of eternity. There were times when the rite was public, a spectacle woven into festivals of renewal. In the city of Edfu, during the feast of Horus, the ritual was performed beneath banners of gold linen. Drums pulsed like the heartbeat of the earth, while women scattered lotus petals into the wind. The initiate, often trembling, stood at the center of a circle formed by his kin. The priest approached with calm precision, his movements practiced and slow. The moment of the cut was met not with screams but with silence, a silence so vast that even the river seemed to pause. When it was done, the blood was caught in a basin shaped like a sun disk, to be later poured into the Nile as offering. The river accepted it without judgment, carrying it away to merge with the sea. In the quiet aftermath, incense would rise, mingling the scent of lotus with that of blood and oil. The child's mother would sing softly, her voice trembling between sorrow and pride. She knew that what had been taken was more than flesh, it was a symbol of entry into the divine order, a joining with the lineage of the gods. The act was both wound and healing, loss and gain, marking the threshold between innocence and identity. As she held her son close, the priests would chant that the gods had seen and approved, that he was now part of the eternal story written into Egypt's soul. Outside the temple, the desert stretched endlessly, an ocean of silence. The stars above mirrored the lights of the city below, as if heaven and earth were reflections of the same sacred geometry. The Egyptians believed that the stars were souls, eternal and watching, guiding the rituals of men below. In that endless night, the act of circumcision became a way of anchoring the cosmic to the human, a way of ensuring that the divine patterns did not dissolve into chaos. Each ritual was a reaffirmation of Mot, the principle of balance and truth. The blade was thus not merely a tool but a compass, pointing always toward equilibrium. Over time, other lands along the Nile adopted their own variations of the ritual. Nubians, Libyans, and certain desert tribes took the practice and shaped it to their own cosmologies. Some performed it at birth, others at puberty, some saw it as purification, others as a test of endurance. But the roots all led back to the same soil, to the Nile's whisper, to the eternal hum beneath Egypt's sands. From there, the custom spread quietly, following the paths of trade and conquest. When the Israelites lived among the Egyptians, they, too, absorbed the language of the blade. Yet when they left, they transformed it, turning what had been cosmic into covenantal, shifting the act from offering to obedience. But in Egypt, the act never lost its mystery. It remained suspended between the worlds of body and spirit, neither wholly practical nor purely symbolic. For the Egyptians, nothing was simple, and everything was sacred. The human form itself was a temple, and the act of altering it was akin to renovating the house of the gods. The foreskin was not discarded carelessly, it was buried in sanctified sand or burned with herbs, its smoke rising toward Ra's chariot in the morning sky. The priests said the smoke carried the soul's impurities upward, dissolving them in sunlight. In their art, the Egyptians captured the ritual not as horror but as harmony. On the walls of Saqqara's tombs, one can see faint carvings of men kneeling, their faces calm, their bodies poised in surrender. There is no agony in their expressions, only acceptance, as if the act itself were a form of meditation. The hieroglyphs that accompany these images speak not of pain, but of awakening. The word they used for circumcision, seb, meaning to purify, appears again and again in temple inscriptions, tied always to the renewal of the soul. It is easy for modern eyes to see only the knife and the wound. But to the Egyptians, both were instruments of transformation. The cut was not a violation, it was the dawn made visible on the horizon of the body. They believed that through ritual bloodletting, life itself was renewed, just as the Nile's annual flood restored the land. And so, each year, as the river rose, so too did the people reaffirm their covenant with the Eternal. Circumcision was not merely a human custom, it was Egypt's way of echoing the heartbeat of creation. And when the priests returned to their temples at dusk, they would light new torches, letting the flames' reflection shimmer across their bronze blades. The desert outside would hum with ancient silence, the kind that listens more than it speaks. The wind would carry whispers from the tombs, murmurs of pharaohs who had gone to join the stars. The rites of the flesh, it seemed, were never about the flesh alone. They were about memory, about the desire to be remembered not as transient beings, but as part of an unbroken chain reaching back to the first dawn. As the last priest extinguished the sacred flame, the temple would fall into shadow. And somewhere, far across the desert, the Nile continued to move, slow, deliberate, eternal. It carried with it the faint trace of all that had been offered to it, the songs, the prayers, the blood, the silence. The river never forgot. And in its ceaseless flow lay the first truth of circumcision, that what is cut away does not vanish. It becomes part of the current that shapes all things, unseen yet everlasting. The desert was silent, yet it breathed. A silence not of emptiness, but of waiting, a silence that listened more deeply than any man could speak. The dunes moved slowly, like the tides of a timeless sea, erasing footsteps as if to remind those who crossed it that memory belonged only to the wind. Beneath that pale sky, a tribe wandered, carrying within them not only tents and flocks, but an idea, a whisper that had begun somewhere between the realm of gods and the marrow of men. It was not written in stone, nor spoken in thunder. It was carried in the heart, fragile and burning. It was called the covenant. They said it began with a voice. A voice that came not from the heavens above, but from within, the kind of voice that could be mistaken for thought if not for the weight it carried. It spoke to one man among many, a shepherd of no great renown, whose only inheritance was faith and a long horizon of sand. His name was Abram. He was not yet the patriarch, not yet the father of nations, not yet the man history would rename as Abraham. He was only a wanderer listening to something eternal. And the voice that found him did not promise ease or safety. It promised something far more mysterious, a lineage bound by faith, sealed not in words, but in flesh and memory. The desert around him stretched endlessly, as though it were the body of a sleeping God. In its stillness, Abram began to understand that the divine did not dwell in temples or idols, but in the act of obedience, in surrendering something deeply human for something invisible and infinite. The covenant, he realized, was not a contract. It was an exchange of trust between creation and Creator. And to mark it, there would be a sign, a gesture of permanence, carved not on stone tablets or papyrus, but upon the very vessel of life itself. When that command came, it was not shouted. It arrived like the shifting of the wind, like the subtle coolness that precedes dawn. The ritual it demanded was not for public eyes or grand ceremony. It was something private, sacred, and irreversible. It was, in essence, the echo of the Egyptian blade, yet its meaning was reborn. No longer was the act tied to the cosmic balance of sun and river, now it was bound to the language of covenant, to faith and remembrance. What had once been a gesture of purity became a symbol of belonging, a mark of promise between man and the unseen. From that moment onward, each generation of Abraham's descendants would bear that mark, not as ornamentation, but as testimony. It was said to be the bridge between heaven and the human heart, the visible proof of an invisible bond. For the Hebrews, this ritual was not about domination of the body, but sanctification of it. The flesh itself became scripture, carrying the story of divine intimacy forward through time. It was both a boundary and an invitation, a way of saying, we remember. And so they wandered, the children of the covenant, through deserts and valleys, through hunger and exile. Each night, when the stars appeared like sparks flung from the forge of creation, they would look upward and recall the voice that had begun their story. Their God was not one of idols or rivers or statues. Their God was a God of breath, of promise, of fire that burned unseen. The covenant they carried was their map through darkness, their reminder that faith was not comfort, but endurance. In their sacred texts, generations later, scribes would write of that promise with trembling reverence. The words would speak of nations yet unborn, of blessings and burdens intertwined. But beneath the language of law and lineage lay a deeper truth, that the ritual of the covenant was less about flesh and more about transformation. Each person who took part in it did so as a symbol of renewal, of alignment with something vast and unknowable. It was an act of faith so intimate it could not be fully explained, only lived. In time, the ritual spread across the tribes, carried through campfires and deserts, passed from father to son like an heirloom of devotion. It was no longer the echo of Egypt's theology, nor the relic of ancient medicine. It had become a sign of identity. To belong to the covenant was to stand in the lineage of the promise, to be bound to the voice that had once called Abram out of Ur. The Hebrews became a people marked by remembrance. Wherever they went, even in exile, even in silence, they could not forget who they were. But the desert has a way of testing every promise. There were nights when the wind howled with such loneliness that faith itself seemed to vanish into the dunes. During those long wanderings, through Egypt, through Sinai, through the wilderness of thirst, the covenant became not just a mark, but a question. Was the voice still speaking? Was the promise still alive? In the endless struggle between belief and despair, the ritual endured as the one unbroken thread. It was the ember that refused to die. In those wandering years, the desert itself seemed to conspire with the divine. The people who followed Moses through the wilderness found that the sand was both trial and teacher. It stripped them of all illusion, leaving only their faith as shelter. The covenant, once a private oath, became a collective memory. Each generation inherited it as a weight and a blessing, a reminder that their relationship with the divine was not forged in power, but in surrender. The desert became their temple, and the silence between the dunes, their prayer. There were times when prophets rose among them, voices burning with the same strange fire that had once spoken to Abraham. They called the people back to remembrance, to faithfulness, to the meaning of the mark. They warned that it was not enough to bear the sign upon the body, it must also be inscribed upon the heart. The prophet spoke in paradoxes, that to keep the covenant was to live not by sight, but by trust, not by inheritance, but by devotion. And though generations faltered, the mark remained, enduring across centuries as quietly as breath. The desert taught them a secret, that promises made in stillness are stronger than empires built in noise. Each morning, when the sun rose over the dunes, it illuminated a people whose survival itself had become sacred testimony. The mark they bore was not a badge of pride, but of remembrance. It reminded them that their God was not confined to stone idols or palaces, but walked beside them in the dust and hunger. It whispered that faith was not measured by what one received, but by what one continued to believe, even in absence. As time passed, the covenant became the heartbeat of a people scattered across lands and languages. Wherever they went, from Babylon to Jerusalem, from exile to return, the ritual followed. It was their tether to eternity. In a world that changed constantly, it remained immutable. It was both history and prophecy, both act and symbol. Scholars would later debate its origins, anthropologists would trace its parallels, theologians would interpret its metaphysics, but for the Hebrews who lived it, it was simply faith made visible. There was a moment in the wilderness when, after long wandering, the tribes paused by a river. It was said that the old generation, weary and doubtful, had faded, and a new one had risen, born in exile, hardened by sand and sun. Before crossing into the land that had been promised to them, they renewed the covenant once more. It was not done out of obligation, but out of remembrance. In that act, they reminded themselves that faith was not inherited, it had to be chosen, again and again. The desert wind carried their chants like prayerful smoke, dissolving into the twilight. In that hour, something profound took shape, the realization that the covenant was not merely a human promise to the divine, but the divine's promise to remain among the human. It was the infinite stooping to meet the finite. The ritual became a way to carry that presence, not as superstition, but as assurance. For even when the temple would later fall, and exile would scatter them across empires, the mark of the covenant would remain, written in the most indelible place, a reminder that no empire could erase the memory of divine intimacy. Through centuries of hardship and diaspora, the covenant endured as both anchor and mirror. It reminded a dispersed people that identity was not geography, not temple, not power, it was memory sanctified through devotion. Even as empires rose and fell, Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome, the promise persisted, whispering across time that what was once sealed in faith could not be undone by history. In this way, the Hebrew covenant stood apart from all others. Where Egypt's blade sought balance, and Babylon's rituals sought favor, the Hebrew mark sought communion. It was not about appeasing the gods but about walking with one. It was a vow that sanctified wandering itself, turning exile into pilgrimage. In the quiet, the ritual spoke, "You are chosen, not because you are mighty, but because you remember." And when night came to the desert, and the stars appeared once more over the tents of the faithful, they looked upon the heavens and saw there the reflection of the same covenant. Each star was a witness, each spark a reminder of that first promise whispered to Abraham beneath the same infinite sky. And though centuries would pass, and kingdoms would crumble into dust, the desert remained, vast, eternal, and listening. For the covenant was not written merely in scripture or ceremony. It was written in the wind, in the silence between heartbeats, in the steady endurance of a people who still believed that the invisible could shape the visible world. And somewhere, beyond the horizon of history, the promise continued to echo, unchanging, unbroken, as eternal as the desert that first bore witness to it. There is a silence in the desert that feels eternal, not an absence of sound, but a fullness of it. The kind that wraps the soul in something beyond comprehension. The wind hums through the stones, and the sun, vast and ancient, beats down like the steady gaze of God Himself. Somewhere within that boundless horizon walks a people whose story will not end. Dust clings to their feet, yet within them burns a promise made long ago, a covenant that has survived kings, famine, slavery, and exile. The Hebrews walk, their shadows long against the sand. Behind them lie centuries of bondage, ahead stretches only the shimmering uncertainty of wilderness. But in their hearts there is something immovable, a mark, invisible yet unbroken, that ties them to the one who brought them out. It is not written on parchment nor carved in stone, though they will one day receive such things. It is carved instead upon their being, a memory of faith, of sacrifice, of blood and breath bound to eternity. Moses leads, staff in hand, his face aged by time yet luminous with a light not of this earth. The people murmur behind him, longing for the flesh pots of Egypt, the certainties of slavery, the comfort of the known. Freedom is a frightening thing when it comes without walls. And so the desert becomes both crucible and mirror, burning away the illusions of control, reflecting back the heart of man in all its frailty and wonder. By day, a pillar of cloud guides them, by night, a pillar of fire. It is said that these were not mere signs, but manifestations, living symbols of presence and mystery. Fire and smoke, the elements through which God first spoke to Moses, now walk beside his people, as though the mountain itself has stretched forth its hand to lead them. In that light, the covenant is renewed not through words, but through endurance. Every step through the wilderness is a reaffirmation, they are his, and he is theirs. At Sinai, the mountain trembles. Lightning forks across the sky like veins of living gold. The people gather below, trembling, for the air itself seems alive with divinity. Thunder rolls like the voice of the deep, and within that vastness, Moses ascends, alone. The people watch as he disappears into the mist, swallowed by glory. For 40 days and nights he remains, caught in a communion so pure that even time seems to falter. When he descends, he carries not only the tablets of law but the reflection of eternity upon his skin. His face glows, radiant and terrible, and the people turn their eyes away, unable to bear the sight. It is said that even he veiled himself thereafter, for the weight of divine encounter leaves marks deeper than the flesh. This is the moment the covenant begins to breathe. What was once the solitary promise to Abraham now becomes the binding heart of a nation. The law, inscribed in stone, mirrors what was once written in spirit. Yet beneath the commandments, beneath every "thou shalt" and "thou shalt not," lies the same truth whispered from the beginning: be faithful. Be mine. But faith is a fragile thing. When Moses lingers too long upon the mountain, the people grow restless. They fashion a calf from gold, shining and solid, a god they can see, touch, and carry. The irony of it, to craft a deity small enough to fit in one's hands, is lost on them in the fever of impatience. When Moses returns, the tablets shatter against the stone, and with them the illusion of innocence. The covenant is tested, and yet, remarkably, not broken. The same God who thundered judgment also extends mercy. Through Moses, the covenant is rewritten, renewed, reforged. It is not erased by failure but refined by it, as gold through fire. In time, the people move again, wandering, waiting, learning. The wilderness becomes a classroom, the law a mirror, and their trials the ink by which their identity is written. Every rebellion births repentance, every drought, dependence. Manna falls like dew. Water springs from stone. The desert, once a place of desolation, becomes holy ground. As generations pass, the covenant deepens. It grows roots in the bones of prophets, kings, and poets. In the age of Joshua, it marches with the people across the Jordan, the waters parting as they once did at the sea. In the time of David, it dances before the ark, a living flame of joy and sorrow. In the voice of Isaiah, it cries out against injustice. In Jeremiah, it weeps beside ruined walls. And through it all, one idea persists, that the bond between the Creator and His people is not one of mere obedience, but of remembrance. They are to remember who they are, and whose they are. To forget the covenant is to forget themselves. Yet memory, like desert wind, is fickle. Empires rise, Assyria, Babylon, and with them come captivity and scattering. The covenant is carried into exile, whispered by the rivers of foreign lands, sung in lamentations that tremble with longing. If I forget thee, O Jerusalem, they cry, let my right hand forget its skill. Even in the silence of Babylonian nights, when the stars feel foreign and the temple lies in ashes, the Hebrews remember. The covenant has no borders. It lives wherever faith endures. Centuries turn. Empires fall. The people return. The temple is rebuilt, though not as before. The ark is gone, lost, hidden, or taken, none can say, yet the covenant remains. It has transformed from an object to an idea, from a ritual to a rhythm of the soul. The Hebrews now see their history as a pattern of exile and return, fall and restoration. Every generation inherits both the burden and the blessing of this eternal promise. Among them rise new voices, the scribes, the sages, the rabbis, who weave the law into words and the covenant into wisdom. They write of purity and devotion, of prayer and repentance. They teach that faith is no longer bound by stone altars, but by the heart's surrender. And in this transformation, something beautiful occurs. The covenant becomes internal, intimate. No longer a nation's decree, but a person's quiet vow. It is here that the old ritual symbols, the ancient marks of flesh and stone, become metaphors for inward devotion. The external gives way to the internal, as the prophets once foresaw. I will write my law upon their hearts, God had said through Jeremiah, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. The Hebrews, scattered yet steadfast, begin to live this truth. Their covenant survives precisely because it transcends the tangible. The centuries grow long again. Rome rises. Judea becomes a province, its kings vassals, its priests divided between power and purity. The temple gleams under Herod's rebuilding, a marvel of white stone and gold, but beneath its splendor stirs disquiet. The people still long for deliverance, for a renewal of the promise once sworn beneath desert skies. They await a Messiah, not merely a ruler, but a restoration. one who will renew the covenant not with tablets or laws, but with life itself. The desert of Sinai seems distant now, but its echo endures in every prayer, every psalm, every cry beneath Roman rule. The Hebrews carry that ancient memory like a pulse beneath the skin. They are still a covenant people, still bound to the eternal voice that spoke through fire and cloud. And yet, in the hidden valleys of time, another transformation begins, quiet, almost imperceptible. The covenant's language, once bound to tribe and temple, begins to whisper to the whole world. The idea that faith might not belong to one people alone, but to all who seek truth, begins to stir like dawn at the edge of history. This is not a replacement of the old, but its unfolding. The covenant, born in the heart of Abraham and tempered through exile, begins to cast its light outward. The Hebrews, through their endurance, have given humanity something more enduring than empire, the idea that relationship with the divine is not inherited by blood, but chosen through belief. And so, through ages of wandering and return, of glory and grief, the desert still speaks. The covenant still breathes. The same wind that once carried the whispers of Moses and the cries of prophets still moves across the sands, carrying with it the eternal promise, I will be with you, even to the end of the age. In the dreamlike silence of the historian's night, the story of the Hebrews lingers like a fragrance, faint yet unmistakable. They are the keepers of memory, the custodians of divine dialogue. Their history is a mirror in which all humanity sees its longing reflected, the desire to be chosen, known, and remembered. The covenant was never only theirs, and yet, it could not have existed without them. Through their trials, the world learned that faith is not an inheritance of ease, but of endurance. That to walk through deserts, literal or spiritual, is to learn the shape of one's soul. Even now, millennia later, the covenant remains. It is whispered in prayers before dawn, sung in Sabbath hymns, etched in the rhythm of hearts that refuse to forget. The blade of promise, once a symbol of separation, has become, in the fullness of time, a sign of belonging. Not of division, but of devotion. And somewhere, in the quiet between stars, the same voice still speaks. Not in thunder, nor fire, but in the still small sound that reaches every willing heart. Remember. There are moments in history when the world itself seems to hold its breath, when time slows, and all the scattered threads of civilization gather into a single, glittering knot. The age of Rome was such a moment. A world encircled by empire, crowned with marble and drenched in blood. Roads stretched like veins across continents, aqueducts whispered the music of order, and the legions marched with the rhythm of thunder. Yet beneath all this splendor, something older stirred, a current of ancient memory flowing beneath the stones. Rome, at its height, was not merely a city. It was a world within a world, an organism, breathing, pulsing, devouring. Its gods were everywhere, and yet nowhere at all, Jupiter on his throne of lightning, Mars in the smoke of battle, Venus shimmering in the mirrors of courtesans. But the Romans were not born to invent divinity, they were born to inherit it. Every conquered people brought their own gods, their own rites, their own whispers of the divine, and Rome, pragmatic and hungry, absorbed them all. To walk through the Forum was to pass through a living museum of humanity's sacred imagination. Egyptian obelisks stood beside Greek statues. Syrian idols shared space with Latin altars. Even the rites of the Hebrews, strange, austere, defiant, found a reluctant place in the Roman mosaic, though their faith refused the polite blending Rome preferred. The empire thrived on order, but within that order lay a profound unease. It is the paradox of greatness: the more the empire expands, the more fragile its soul becomes. For beneath the triumphal arches and golden eagles, Rome was haunted by the awareness that no empire is eternal. The story of circumcision in the Roman world is not one of ritual reverence but of suspicion, curiosity, and contempt. To the Romans, the Hebrew practice was both alien and intimate, a scar that spoke of other laws, other loyalties. In a culture that prized the perfection of the human form, where marble bodies gleamed untouched by the knife, the mark of the covenant was seen as disfigurement. It whispered of difference, of resistance to assimilation, and Rome, vast and proud, did not easily tolerate resistance. Yet Rome was also fascinated by what it feared. In the baths, whispers circulated about the Eastern rites, about strange gods who demanded blood, devotion, and secrecy. Circumcision became, in the Roman imagination, not merely a ritual, but a symbol of the mysterious East, of lands where God spoke in thunder and prophets burned with madness. To some, it was barbaric, to others, exotic. But to all, it was a reminder that not everything could be conquered. Still, Rome tried. Through decree and domination, it sought to tame even the soul. When Emperor Hadrian outlawed circumcision, he believed he was erasing a superstition. But laws cannot unmake memory. They cannot unwrite faith. The blade that had marked a people for millennia was older than any emperor, and sharper than any law. And so, in quiet defiance, the practice continued, hidden, whispered, preserved. In Roman Judea, every act of devotion became an act of rebellion. Every newborn boy, when marked, became a living protest against oblivion. And in that resistance, something miraculous endured, a thread connecting Abraham's covenant to the age of Caesar. But Rome's story, like the stories of Egypt and Babylon before it, was always shadowed by the inevitability of decay. Marble cracks. Gold tarnishes. Power fades. The empire that sought eternity found itself surrounded by mortality, its gods reduced to echoes in hollow temples. The old rituals persisted, but without conviction. Sacrifice became spectacle, faith became formality. The augurs still read the flight of birds, but no one believed the sky was speaking anymore. The philosopher Seneca once wrote that religion was regarded by the common people as true, by the wise as false, and by the rulers as useful. In that quiet cynicism lies the tragedy of Rome, a civilization that could master the body, the law, the earth itself, but not the spirit. For when faith becomes performance, the gods begin to die. And yet, even in that twilight, something new was stirring. In the alleys of Jerusalem, in the markets of Antioch, in the catacombs beneath the very heart of Rome, a small flame began to burn, faint, fragile, but unyielding. It whispered of love and sacrifice, of a covenant renewed not by blade or blood alone, but by spirit. It spoke in parables, in silence, in suffering. And though Rome would try to extinguish it, that flame would one day outlast the empire itself. In the centuries of empire, the human body became both canvas and battlefield, a site upon which identity was written and rewritten. The Roman baths, with their marble basins and clouds of steam, were not merely places of cleansing, but of revelation. There, stripped of garments and titles, all men were equal before the gaze of the crowd. And there, too, the marks of faith, the small, invisible scars, became signs of difference, of belonging to another law. For some, these marks were shameful. For others, sacred. But for Rome, obsessed with uniformity, they were dangerous. To bear a mark unseen by the gods of Jupiter was to declare one's allegiance to something higher, older, beyond imperial reach. And in this tension between empire and identity, the story of circumcision took on new meaning. No longer merely a physical act, it became a quiet rebellion, a reminder that not all power is visible, and not all loyalty can be commanded. To understand Rome's unease with the ritual is to understand Rome's deeper fear, that the world it ruled could not be truly owned. Conquest can seize land, but not belief. It can command obedience, but not reverence. The Hebrews had survived Egypt, Babylon, and now Rome itself, precisely because their faith was portable, bound not to temples of stone, but to memory, word, and wound. This frightened the Romans, though they could not admit it. For an empire built on monuments cannot comprehend a people who carry their temple within. The Roman historian Tacitus once remarked, with both admiration and disdain, that the Jews regard the profane as sacred and the sacred as profane. He could not grasp their inversion of worldly order, that to serve an unseen God was greater than to worship emperors of flesh. Rome's gods demanded loyalty, the God of the covenant demanded the heart. In that quiet difference lay the seed of revolution. As the centuries turned, the empire began to feel the slow ache of its own enormity. Roads that once carried legions now carried merchants, pilgrims, and rumors. The Pax Romana, that proud peace enforced by the sword, began to fray at the edges. The northern tribes stirred. The frontiers grew restless. Yet within the heart of the empire, in candlelit rooms where whispers of new faiths intertwined with old ones, something began to change. In the shadows of Rome's catacombs, early Christians met in secret, descendants of both Jewish and Gentile worlds, bound by a shared belief in renewal. Their rituals, though shaped by Hebrew origins, began to transform. Circumcision, once the mark of covenant, gave way to baptism, a new symbol for a new age. Water replaced blade. Spirit replaced flesh. Yet the echo of the old remained. The covenant did not die, it evolved. And here lies the strange poetry of history, that one ancient act of devotion, born in desert tents under the stars of Abraham, should find its shadow beneath the marble arches of Rome. That what began as a private sign between man and God would ripple outward until it reshaped empires. Still, the old tension persisted. Rome, though slowly turning Christian, could not entirely forget its pagan heart. The emperors who once called themselves divine now bowed to a crucified Savior. Temples became churches. Priests became bishops. But beneath the hymns, the empire still sought control. The new faith, though spiritual in promise, inherited Rome's earthly desire for order. And so the paradox deepened. The empire of the sword became the empire of the cross, a transformation both miraculous and monstrous. In the centuries to come, the question of the covenant would re-emerge in new forms. Who belongs? Who is chosen? What must be cut away for faith to live? Rome, even as it baptized itself, could not escape the shadow of its old gods. The marble still gleamed, the incense still rose, the rituals, though renamed, still bore the rhythm of empire. Faith had triumphed, but had it changed, or merely shifted its face? When the historian looks back on Rome, it is easy to see the grandeur, the columns, the mosaics, the poetry of Virgil and the stoicism of Marcus Aurelius. But listen longer, beneath the applause of victory, and another sound emerges, the slow, persistent hum of mortality. Every empire carries within itself the faint heartbeat of its own end. In the ashes of time, Rome would crumble, its gods would fade, its language would fracture. But the ideas that once terrified it, faith, covenant, conscience, would endure. They would travel east and west, north and south, carried by pilgrims, prophets, and dreamers. The empire that tried to erase the covenant instead preserved it, inadvertently ensuring its immortality. And so, when the final fires of Rome dimmed, and the last emperor's crown was lost to the dust, the world that rose from its ruins carried something eternal. The shadow of eternity, the same longing that had once drawn Abraham to the desert, Moses to the mountain, and countless others to the edge of mystery, still lingered, stretching like a twilight horizon beyond empire, beyond history, beyond flesh. For though empires fall, the covenant endures. And though the marble cracks, the memory does not. It waits, as it always has, for those who will remember the whisper that began it all. Walk before me, and be blameless. The fall of Rome did not come with thunder. It came with a sigh. Not the crash of a collapsing wall, but the long exhale of a world weary of itself. The marble cities did not vanish overnight, their ruins sank slowly into the earth, like old thoughts fading in the mind of time. Yet in that twilight, something remarkable happened. The empire, which had conquered by sword, began to live on through spirit. When we speak of Rome's fall, we imagine chaos, invasion, the end of order. But in truth, the empire did not die, it dissolved into the bloodstream of history. Its roads became the arteries of a new faith. Its law became the scaffold of new nations. Its language became the vessel of prayer. Rome had tried to contain eternity, and in doing so, became its servant. But even as this transformation unfolded, the memory of empire lingered like smoke after incense. The dream of control, of unity beneath a single power, haunted every kingdom that rose in its wake. And beneath that dream lay a deeper question, one that the Old Covenant, and the mark that sealed it, had never ceased to ask: what does it mean to belong? In the centuries after Constantine, the empire's center shifted from marble to mystery. The Colosseum stood silent, its arches broken, its sands turned to dust. Yet across the Mediterranean, new cathedrals rose, great stone vessels of light, filled with the echoes of Gregorian chant. The empire had not vanished, it had become invisible, reimagined as Christendom. And in this vast transformation, ancient rituals were reinterpreted through the lens of grace. The blade that once sealed a covenant in flesh gave way to the water of baptism, cool and flowing. The mark became metaphor. The wound became word. What was once a symbol of separation, between tribe and stranger, chosen and unchosen, now whispered of inclusion, of rebirth, of spiritual renewal. And yet, the echoes of the Old Covenant did not disappear. Beneath the hymns and creeds, the memory of the ancient promise still pulsed. The early fathers of the Church, scholars of both Scripture and Empire, debated endlessly about continuity and difference. Was the covenant of Abraham fulfilled or transformed? Did the mark of flesh give way to the mark of faith, or did it remain as an eternal sign of origin? In these questions, theology and history intertwined like roots beneath stone. For Rome had not only adopted the symbols of the covenant, it had reinterpreted them in its own image. The empire that once mocked Jewish ritual now knelt before an Easter Messiah. But in this kneeling, it carried forward the old paradox, the tension between flesh and spirit, law and love, empire and eternity. Imagine, for a moment, the streets of Rome in the 5th century, the marble faded, the statues eroded, the air thick with incense and uncertainty. The Senate still meets, but its debates echo through half-empty halls. Outside, monks walk barefoot through ruins, whispering psalms in a tongue the Caesars never spoke. The world is changing, and no one yet knows what it is becoming. A Roman mother lifts her infant from the baptismal font. The child's cries mingle with the murmur of Latin prayers. Nearby, an old man watches, a descendant of those who once served in the legions. His ancestors marked their sons in the old way, this child is marked by water instead of blade. Yet he wonders, quietly, if the difference is so great. For both rituals speak of belonging, both promise protection, both demand remembrance. Faith, after all, is an inheritance, not of empire, but of longing. And in this sense, Rome did not destroy the old rites, it translated them. It transformed covenant into creed, circumcision into baptism, sacrifice into sacrament. The outward changed, the inward endured. The Middle Ages would call themselves Christendom, but the bones of Rome lay beneath their feet. Monks copied Virgil by candlelight, preserving the pagan past even as they prayed for salvation. Pilgrims walked along Roman roads, tracing paths once trodden by legions. In their hymns, the rhythm of Latin, the empire's own heartbeat, continued. And so, in an act of strange poetry, the empire that had feared the mark of the covenant became the very means by which that covenant's legacy spread across the world. But every inheritance carries shadows. The Church, inheriting Rome's power, also inherited its hunger for control. It built not just cathedrals but systems. Not just faith but hierarchy. The same impulse that once built aqueducts and armies now built dogma and doctrine. The sacred was mapped, categorized, made to fit within the geometry of empire. And yet, no geometry can contain mystery. In monasteries, mystics began to whisper another language, not of law, but of love. They spoke of the inner covenant, the hidden blade that cuts away illusion, pride, and self. For them, the story of circumcision became a parable, the removal not of flesh, but of distance between the soul and God. To be marked, in their eyes, was to be made open, vulnerable to divine presence. The old rite had turned inward, its blade now spiritual, its wound invisible but profound. Still, the old debates lingered. In the medieval courts of theology, scholars wrestled with the question of continuity. Was the covenant eternal, or had it been fulfilled and surpassed? Some argued that the promise to Abraham was forever, that God's word could not be undone. Others claimed the new covenant had replaced the old, the water of baptism washing away the need for blood. This conflict was not merely doctrinal, it was existential. It spoke to the human fear of abandonment, of being forgotten by God. To claim one covenant replaced another was to risk erasing an entire lineage of faith. To claim both endured was to risk contradiction. And so, for centuries, the argument persisted, echoing through cathedrals and cloisters alike, unresolved, perhaps unresolvable. Meanwhile, in the shadows of history, the Jewish people endured, scattered, exiled, yet unbroken. They carried their covenant across continents, from the sands of Arabia to the ghettos of Europe. Where Rome had fallen, they remained. Where emperors had perished, their prayers continued. In them, the mark of the old promise lived on, quiet, defiant, eternal. As centuries turned, the world changed its shape again. Empires rose and fell in Rome's long shadow. The Renaissance rediscovered the marble and the mind of antiquity. Artists painted the covenant anew in gold and pigment, draping biblical figures in Roman robes, placing them in landscapes more Italian than Judean. The old and new converged in the theater of art, where history itself became a kind of dream. In the cathedrals of Florence, the story of Abraham and Isaac was painted beside scenes of the crucifixion, two moments, two blades, two covenants intertwined. The artists may not have known it, but they were painting a single story, humanity's long struggle to understand sacrifice, obedience, and divine intimacy. Every brushstroke whispered the same quiet truth, that all faith begins in longing, and all longing seeks a promise. In the academies and libraries of Europe, scholars began to study the ancient languages once more, Hebrew, Greek, Latin. The old text spoke again. The covenant, once confined to scripture, now became subject to curiosity. Philosophers debated its meaning not in cathedrals, but in salons. Circumcision became a metaphor for philosophy itself, the cutting away of ignorance, the stripping down to essence. What had once been a ritual of faith became, in time, a symbol of intellect. The blade moved from flesh to thought. But no age remains innocent of its own pride. The Enlightenment, with its hunger for reason, looked upon ancient rites with skepticism. Circumcision, once sacred, became a puzzle, a relic of superstition, a subject of anthropological fascination. Scholars wrote of its origins, its symbolism, its persistence among primitive cultures. The language of mystery was replaced by the language of science. And yet, beneath this veneer of rationality, the old unease remained. Why had this ritual endured so long, across so many civilizations? What secret power did it hold, that empires could rise and fall, yet the blade's echo never fade? Perhaps because, at its heart, the act was never only about the body. It was about remembrance, the same remembrance that bound Rome to its gods, that bound monks to their prayers, that binds every human being to something larger than themselves. The covenant, whether in flesh or in faith, endures because it speaks to the oldest truth, that to be human is to yearn for belonging, for meaning, for contact with the infinite. In the final centuries of Rome's shadow, the modern age, the covenant became quieter, yet more universal. No longer the mark of a nation, it became a symbol of the human condition. The ancient act of circumcision found new contexts, medical, cultural, moral, but its original resonance still haunted the background. Each time the blade touched flesh, consciously or not, it echoed the first promise made under desert stars. Even now, in the world of steel and satellites, the old story whispers through the corridors of time. Rome's stones crumble, but its roads remain. The covenant's flesh may fade, but its spirit continues to shape hearts, philosophies, and civilizations. We live, unknowingly, in the shadow of both empire and eternity, two forces that have always defined our species, the will to conquer, and the longing to be chosen. And in the quiet spaces between those forces, between the empire's law and the covenant's love, humanity continues to walk. Sometimes proud, sometimes lost, but always seeking the voice that first called to Abraham, "Walk before me." For even in the ruins of Rome, that whisper still lingers. The same wind that once carried the scent of sacrifice now moves through the cracks of cathedrals, through the pages of forgotten books, through the minds of those who dream of meaning. The covenant, like empire, is never truly gone. It changes form, it finds new vessels, it hides in art, in ritual, in longing. And perhaps that is the truest mark of all, not the wound upon the body, nor the law upon the stone, but the quiet ache within the soul that refuses to forget. In the end, the empire and the covenant are two reflections of the same desire, one reaching upward through conquest, the other inward through surrender. Rome sought eternity through dominion, the covenant sought it through devotion. Both touched the divine, and both fell short, yet together they tell the story of humankind's restless heart. The historian, tracing these echoes through the centuries, finds not answers but harmonies, the resonance between blade and baptism, marble and faith, law and mercy. The shadow of eternity falls across them all, soft and inevitable, as the stars once fell upon the tents of Abraham and the domes of Rome alike. Somewhere, in that endless space between heaven and history, the two still meet, empire and faith, dust and promise, and in their meeting, they remind us that nothing sacred is ever truly lost. Only transformed. In the twilight of the 19th century, when empires glittered with the promise of progress and science spoke in the language of precision and steel, an old ritual began to shift its shape. What had once been born beneath desert suns and temple fires, whispered in sacred vows and ancestral songs, began to don the white coat of modernity. The blade that once marked a covenant with the divine found itself glimmering under gaslight, inside hospitals that smelled of carbolic acid and steam. The transformation was not abrupt, it was a slow dream, a merging of myth and medicine, of ritual and rationality. And in that merging, something ancient awoke again, dressed in the garments of modern science. The Victorians, those tireless architects of order and cleanliness, lived in a world trembling between faith and reason. Disease haunted their cities like a fog. The unseen world of germs had just been discovered, and fear of contamination became a theology of its own. Into this climate of anxiety came the revival of old acts dressed in new justifications. It was said that cleanliness was next to godliness, and the body became a battlefield between purity and decay. The knife, once sacred, became sanitary. The ritual that had spoken of divine promise now spoke of medical progress, of hygiene, of control. Yet beneath the surface, the same ancient tremor remained, the fear of mortality, the desire to mark the body with meaning, the need to define belonging through transformation. Hospitals became the new temples, their tiled corridors echoing with footsteps that carried both hope and dread. White uniforms replaced priestly robes, scalpels replaced flint blades, consent forms replaced covenants. Yet, in some mysterious way, the act was not entirely reborn, it was remembered. Each incision carried echoes of forgotten altars. Each clinical procedure hummed with an ancient rhythm, a ritualized choreography performed in the name of health rather than holiness. And still, the underlying impulse, the yearning to sanctify the flesh, to master it, to purify it, remained unchanged. The new justifications multiplied with the fervor of faith. Physicians spoke of hygiene, of disease prevention, of social betterment. Parents were told it was for protection, for moral cleanliness, for the good of the child. Pamphlets spread through cities and colonies, carrying this modern creed across oceans. In England, America, and far-flung territories, the language of the body was rewritten in the grammar of science. Yet what science could not erase was the mystery behind the act itself, the strange comfort of believing that transformation could begin with a cut, that salvation, whether physical or spiritual, could begin with a wound. As the 20th century dawned, the ritual had become ubiquitous, normalized, even invisible. The ancient echoes hid behind polished instruments and sterile gloves. In the West, doctors performed it as routine, often without ceremony, yet always with quiet finality. The body of the modern man bore an unseen mark of an older world. Even those who never knew the temple, never heard the covenantal songs, still carried the vestige of an ancient obedience, transmitted not through scripture but through medical policy and cultural habit. And there was something uncanny about this continuity. Civilization prided itself on progress, on reason's triumph over superstition, yet it had unknowingly preserved one of its oldest and most enigmatic rites. The sacred had gone underground, reappearing as policy, as hygiene, as a cultural norm whose origins few remembered but many followed. This was the secret continuum, the thread that tied the desert prophet to the Victorian surgeon, the covenantal promise to the medical chart, the sacred wound to the clinical scar. The language changed, but the meaning hummed beneath it like a low, inaudible chord, persistent and haunting. Scholars began to notice the strangeness of it all. Anthropologists in the early 20th century, tracing the inheritance of rituals across civilizations, observed how easily the human mind repackaged old beliefs into new forms. What had been ritual purity in the age of temples became hygienic modernity in the age of science. What had once been a covenant with God became a promise to society, a mark of civilization itself. The notion that one could be made cleaner, purer, better by altering the flesh endured, even when the divine had been replaced by the doctor. The language of empire played its role too. In colonial territories, European powers often carried the practice with them, not as a gift of faith but as a badge of civilization. Missionaries and medics, often indistinguishable in their zeal, spoke of salvation and sanitation in the same breath. And so, the ancient act spread not as ritual but as regimen, as part of the empire's invisible machinery of assimilation. In the colonies, bodies became sites of control, of standardization, of invisible power. The ritual was both medical and political, both intimate and imperial. There were doctors who questioned it, who saw in it not science but superstition reborn. Yet even their doubts could not unmake the momentum of belief. Hospitals taught it. Governments endorsed it. Insurance systems covered it. It became a silent inheritance, unchallenged, unspoken, and yet deeply rooted. The world had changed its gods, but it had not changed its need for ritual. In the sterile glow of electric light, the act continued, now accompanied by the hum of machinery and the soft rhythm of breath under anesthesia. The modern patient lay where once a supplicant had knelt. The prayer had been replaced by protocol, the blessing by consent. Yet if one listened closely, beneath the language of medicine, one could still hear the ancient undertone, a whisper about purity, about belonging, about the price of being made whole. Psychologists in the mid-century began to speak of symbolism, of how societies externalized their collective fears through ritualized acts. Some said the modern world was haunted by its own secular faiths, the belief in progress, in cleanliness, in control over the unruly body. And in the quiet procedure rooms of modern hospitals, that faith was enacted every day, unacknowledged but devout. As decades passed, debates began to stir. Some called it tradition, others questioned its necessity. Yet even in the questioning, the act retained its aura of inevitability. Like an old melody played on new instruments, its meaning shifted but never disappeared. To abandon it entirely would be to sever a thread that had bound human flesh to human meaning for millennia. It was, after all, more than an operation. It was an echo of the oldest human preoccupation, the fear of chaos, and the hope that pain, if given purpose, could redeem. And so, the story of the blade continued, no longer a temple rite, but a medical one, no longer a covenant with the divine, but with modernity itself. Yet perhaps, in some unseen way, the two were not so different. Both sought to impose order upon mystery. Both sought to tame what was wild in the body. Both promised protection, belonging, and purity. And both whispered to the same quiet fear that has haunted humanity since its beginning, that to be human is to be vulnerable, to bleed, to carry both sin and salvation in the same fragile flesh. In this twilight of the modern age, one can almost sense the convergence of all these eras, the priest and the surgeon, the prophet and the hygienist, the ritual and the research paper. They are mirrors of each other, reflecting an unbroken fascination with the transformative wound. The body, it seems, has always been humanity's most sacred text, rewritten by every age to speak its language of control and grace. And as the lights of the 20th century dimmed into the uncertain dawn of the new millennium, the question that had haunted the ancients remained unanswered, even unspoken: did the ritual survive because it was useful, or because it was sacred? Did science preserve it out of necessity, or because something deep within the human psyche needed it to persist? The answer lies somewhere in the quiet overlap between medicine and mystery, where progress becomes myth and healing becomes faith. The continuum endures, quiet as breath, ancient as dust, and invisible as the thread that binds memory to flesh. By the late 20th century, the world began to turn its gaze inward. The age of empires had dissolved, the old gods of progress had grown quiet, and a new kind of questioning took root in the collective mind. Science had conquered much of what had once been mystery, yet the human heart remained unsatisfied. The same ritual that had once marked faith, then hygiene, now stood at the crossroads of identity, ethics, and remembrance. People began to ask, not just how the ritual endured, but why it had to. And though the answers multiplied like mirrors, none could erase the shadow of its history. In the sterile rooms of hospitals, the act had become routine, devoid of ceremony, performed as part of a schedule of procedures whose meaning was rarely discussed. Yet in the quiet corners of thought, scholars and poets, physicians and philosophers began to sense something uncanny in its persistence. It was not merely habit that had kept the old ritual alive, but a deeper current, something archetypal, woven into humanity's relationship with the body and its transformation. To alter the flesh was to assert control over destiny, to draw a boundary between chaos and order, to reaffirm that human will could shape what nature had given. The 20th century loved control. It built machines that flew, split atoms, mapped genes. It built hospitals that gleamed like temples to human ingenuity. And within those temples, the ritual of transformation continued, not in the name of gods, but in the name of health, cleanliness, and normalcy. Yet for all its precision, medicine often moved in the same rhythm as myth. Both sought to comfort the fear of decay, to frame mortality in the language of mastery. And so, the old wound, sanctified in sand and stone, continued under the cold fluorescence of surgical light. In universities, anthropologists began to speak of continuity, of how the past survives not as memory but as instinct. Some called it cultural inertia, others called it the echo of the sacred. They noted that the modern world, even in its pursuit of reason, could not escape ritual. The symbols changed, the meanings shifted, but the essence remained, the belief that the body could bear meaning beyond its biology. The flesh had always been the first scripture, written upon by hands both divine and human. By the 1960s and 70s, as the world reeled from revolutions of thought, some began to resist the ritual. Voices rose questioning the authority of tradition, of medicine, of power itself. The same modern mind that had embraced the knife now began to fear it, not as a relic of faith, but as a symbol of conformity. For the first time in centuries, the act was debated openly, ethically, publicly. And yet, as arguments circled, scientific, moral, personal, one thing became clear: humanity could no longer claim ignorance of the act's ancestry. Beneath every rationale lay a ghost of its origin. This was the era when science and spirit began to blur once more, when psychology entered the conversation and myth found new vocabulary. The dreamlike continuity of human ritual became a subject of fascination, how the mind carries forward what the heart cannot let go. Some writers describe the modern hospital as the final temple, the last place where transformation still occurs under a collective hush. Here, the doctor became the priest of a secular faith, his instruments the relics of reason. Yet the essence of the moment, the surrender of flesh, the invocation of healing, the hope of renewal, remained as ancient as ever. In literature and art, echoes of the ancient rite appeared again, transmuted into metaphors of awakening and loss. The mark upon the body became a symbol of the modern soul's restlessness, the desire to feel connection in an age of detachment. Films and novels spoke of identity, of the need to belong, of the strange comfort found in ritual repetition. The world, though cloaked in technology, still dreamt in the language of its ancestors. As the century turned and the digital age dawned, the continuum grew quieter but no less potent. The body became data, the ritual a statistic, the wound a form on a medical chart. Yet within the vast web of the modern mind, the same ancient pulse remained. Humanity's fascination with transformation endured, it simply found new mediums. Cosmetic surgery, genetic engineering, body modification, all carried the same fundamental yearning: to define, to purify, to transcend. The tools had changed, but the mythology persisted. Doctors of the new millennium spoke of informed consent, of ethics committees, of cultural sensitivity. Yet even in their careful language, there lingered the shadow of history. For every scientific justification, there was still that old undertone, the idea that through the body, one could touch the ineffable. That through the act of change, one could approach perfection, or at least the illusion of it. Modernity, for all its rationality, was still haunted by its sacred past. And in the quiet hours of the night, in hospitals that never sleep, the cycle continued. A nurse checked instruments. A doctor signed a chart. Somewhere, the air smelled faintly of antiseptic and history. The hum of machines masked the silence of the old world, but if one could listen carefully enough, beneath the sterile rhythm of progress, the whisper of ritual was still there, soft, persistent, eternal. Scholars in the 21st century began to look at this persistence as a kind of dream logic, a deep cultural hypnosis that transcends belief or reason. They argued that rituals do not disappear, they transform. That humanity's oldest patterns survive because they address questions that never vanish. What is the body? What is purity? What does it mean to belong? In the bright, digital modernity of the 21st century, those questions still lingered like faint stars over an ancient landscape. And perhaps that is the great paradox of progress, that even as humanity moves forward, it carries the weight of its beginnings. The tools of medicine may have replaced the symbols of faith, but the emotions remain, the awe, the fear, the yearning for transcendence. Every time the human hand changes the body, it reenacts the oldest drama, the attempt to make meaning out of mortality. The ritual, whether called sacred or clinical, becomes a meditation on the fragile boundary between life and death, chaos and order, nature and will. Now, in the modern world where science reigns and gods sleep, the blade has become invisible, hidden behind bureaucracy, consent forms, and sterile fields. Yet its shadow remains everywhere, in the architecture of hospitals, in the language of purity, in the quiet rituals of cleanliness and care. It is no longer called sacred, yet it moves with the same gravity, the same reverence for the transformation it promises. In this way, the continuum persists not as belief, but as memory, an inherited hum that resonates through the centuries. We no longer gather in temples, but in waiting rooms. We no longer speak prayers, but sign our names. Yet something deep and ancient watches through our actions, remembering the desert, the covenant, the firelight, the vow. The story has changed, but the melody remains. The ritual has become history, and history has become ritual. The act, once divine, now mechanical, continues because it has become part of what it means to be human, to seek meaning in transformation, to mark the flesh in hope of renewal, to carry the past forward in the body itself. The thread remains unbroken, stitched through time by countless hands. And perhaps, in the end, that is the quiet revelation at the heart of this history, that the human story is a story of remembering through doing, of carrying forward that which cannot be understood but must be repeated. The ancient blade, now dulled by centuries of interpretation, still gleams faintly in the light of modern thought. Not as a weapon, not even as a tool, but as a mirror, reflecting back to us the strange continuity between the sacred and the scientific, between belief and biology, between what we were and what we remain. The hospitals of today may not know it, but they stand upon the foundations of temples long buried. The hands that heal repeat gestures older than civilization itself. And every time the body is touched in the name of purification, or health, or hope, the continuum breathes again. It is not a story of superstition or science alone. It is a story of human longing, the longing to transform, to transcend, to be made whole in a world forever marked by imperfection. And as the modern age hums with machinery and light, that longing continues to echo softly in the silence beneath the sound, reminding us that history never truly disappears. It only changes form, like smoke reshaping itself above a dying fire. Night settles across the ages like a slow exhale, soft and unending. The story that began in the sands of the ancient world now rests beneath electric skies, where the hum of machines has replaced the sound of wind over stone. Yet the silence feels the same. It is a silence older than language, older than faith, older even than the memory of why humanity first lifted a blade and called the act sacred. It is the silence of continuity, the sound of everything that endures when memory fades, when rituals lose their names, when history dissolves into dream. In this stillness, the past does not disappear. It drifts. The deserts of Egypt glow faintly beneath the sands, temples buried but never entirely gone. Somewhere within their shadows, the priests still chant, their words dissolving into the air. The Hebrew shepherds still gaze at stars that no longer exist, whispering their promises to the unseen. Roman stones, worn smooth by the hands of the forgotten, still echo faintly with the sound of empire. And the sterile light of the modern hospital hums like a low, mechanical hymn. Across millennia, all of it forms one great breath, a long inhalation of meaning, and an even longer exhale of surrender. To walk through this history is to move through a series of mirrors. Each age gazes at its reflection and believes it to be new. Yet if one looks closely enough, the same gestures appear again and again, the cleansing of the hands, the invocation of healing, the quiet faith in transformation. Whether it is the priest, the physician, or the philosopher, each performs the same act, to make sense of the fragile, bleeding miracle that is the human body. The instruments change, but the hands remain the same, trembling, reverent, and afraid. Perhaps that is what all of history truly is, not a record of progress, but a meditation on fear. The fear of decay, of impurity, of losing the boundary between order and chaos. In ancient temples, it was the fear of offending gods. In modern clinics, it became the fear of disease. But in both, the essence is the same, the terror of the uncontrollable. And so, humanity learned to ritualize its fear, to shape it into ceremony, to speak to it through the language of the body. For in the body lies the greatest paradox, it is both the vessel of life and the promise of death, both sacred and corruptible. When one looks back across the arc of civilization, a pattern emerges, not of progress, but of poetry. The same rhythms echo through time, birth, pain, cleansing, renewal. We dress these patterns in different myths, religious, scientific, national, but beneath the surface, they are identical. They are the heartbeat of human continuity. We cut, we heal, we mark, we remember. We carry the past forward through the body itself, through gestures repeated so often that they no longer feel chosen. They simply are. There is something deeply tender in that realization. For all our arrogance, all our claims of evolution and enlightenment, we are still creatures of ritual. We still need touch to believe in transformation. We still build our myths in the language of the body. The ancients built temples to gods of healing, we build hospitals. They prayed for purity, we sterilize. They sought the divine in sacrifice, we seek it in science. The continuum remains, quiet and endless, like a river flowing beneath the crust of time. Yet not all rivers run toward clarity. Some vanish underground, swallowed by the earth, only to resurface centuries later in unexpected places. So too with our rituals. The world believes it has forgotten them, but they reappear in strange new forms, in the language of therapy, in the aesthetics of medicine, in the quiet faith we place in progress. Even the smallest gestures, washing one's hands, lighting a candle, signing a document, are fragments of ancient ceremonies reborn in new tongues. If one listens carefully enough, the whisper of the old world is still there. It speaks in the hush before anesthesia, in the stillness of the waiting room, in the sigh of relief after healing. It speaks through the instinct to mark transitions, birth, maturity, illness, death, with ritual precision. The world has changed its symbols, but not its rhythm. Humanity still seeks to bridge the gap between flesh and spirit, to sanctify what is temporary, to give meaning to what will one day decay. In this quiet knowing lies the heart of the hidden history. It was never truly about the blade or the blood, the covenant or the clinic. It was about memory, about the human need to remember through action, to inscribe belief into the body itself. Every civilization, in its own way, has done this. Every generation inherits the same unspoken truth, that meaning cannot be preserved in words alone. It must be lived, embodied, and sometimes, quite literally, etched into being. As the centuries unfolded, the act that began as a sacred wound became a metaphor for all of human civilization. To create meaning, one must make a mark. To purify, one must confront what is impure. To remember, one must accept the pain of remembering. This is the paradox of humanity's story. We are forever trying to perfect what was never meant to be perfect. The blade, the prayer, the machine, each is just another way of saying the same thing. We are fragile, but we refuse to forget. And so, the modern world, for all its sophistication, still carries the pulse of the ancient one. We scroll through digital records instead of sacred texts, but the impulse is the same, to document, to preserve, to seek permanence. We believe we have transcended ritual, yet every routine of our daily lives, our morning cleansing, our prescribed diets, our scheduled wellness checks, echoes the old structure of devotion. We live in a vast cathedral of invisible rites. When the historian looks back, they will see that humanity never stopped believing. We only changed what we believed in. The divine became the empirical. The sacred became the clinical. The myth became the manual. Yet through it all, the same yearning remains, the yearning to be purified, to be protected, to belong to something larger than oneself. The body is still our altar, our archive, our most enduring scripture. And perhaps that is why the story feels unfinished. Because it cannot end. As long as there are humans, there will be ritual. As long as there is flesh, there will be meaning written upon it. The continuum will persist, not out of superstition, but out of need. For to exist is to be marked, and to be marked is to remember. Now the narrative drifts into the present, where the hum of the hospital merges with the murmur of the past. The same fluorescent lights that illuminate sterile walls seem to cast shadows that stretch back thousands of years. A doctor washes their hands. A patient waits in silence. Outside, the night hums with the low vibration of the world at rest. And in that moment, fleeting, fragile, the boundary between ancient and modern dissolves. The temple and the ward become one. The chant and the monitor tone become indistinguishable. Somewhere in the depths of time, the first priest lowers his head, and the modern physician mirrors him without knowing why. Both are participants in a ritual of transformation. Both carry the same humility before the mystery of life. Both are witnesses to the same truth, that healing and belief are intertwined, that every act of care is also an act of faith. The historian, if they could stand outside time, would see it all as one seamless gesture, an unbroken arc from the deserts of antiquity to the cities of tomorrow. The knife, the hand, the word, the silence, all part of a single, trembling prayer spoken through the body of humanity. It is a prayer for survival, for renewal, for the chance to begin again. And when the prayer ends, what remains is not doctrine or dogma, but the quiet hum of existence, the rhythm of breathing, the pulse beneath the skin. The world turns. Dust gathers. Empires fall. Hospitals crumble. And still, the same question lingers in the air: what does it mean to be human, to inhabit this fragile vessel of memory and pain, to bear the marks of those who came before? Perhaps there is no answer, only the awareness that the question itself is sacred. To ask it is to remember. To remember is to belong. And in that belonging, however transient, lies the essence of every ritual humanity has ever known. So the story ends where it began, in silence. The kind of silence that hums with unseen life, the kind that stretches between heartbeats and centuries. The sands shift. The stars turn. The machines hum. And through it all, the hidden history continues, not as a record, but as a pulse. Close your eyes. Listen to the sound beneath the sound, the soft whisper of history breathing through you. Feel the weight of time resting gently on your skin. Somewhere, far beyond words, the ancient world still moves within you, quiet and enduring. You are its descendant, its witness, its continuation. And as sleep takes hold, the story folds in on itself once more, the blade becomes the hand becomes the prayer, and the prayer becomes silence. The silence that holds everything. The silence that remembers.